If you just read the headlines, you'd think Germany's armed forces are now bristling with new ships, tanks, and guided systems thanks to a historic defense budget surge. But behind the headlines, the true picture will be judged on budget allocations, the gap between contracts and deliveries, industrial capacity, procurement law reforms, advances in AI and cyber, and actual frontline readiness. Today, we break down exactly what Berlin's rearmament drive has accomplished and what's still stuck in the pipeline, setting the stage for how those early promises from 2022 compare with the concrete realities of 2025. From pledges to purchases. Back in early 2022, Berlin's rhetoric marked a sharp departure from decades of caution. In the immediate aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Chancellor addressed Parliament with a pledge for the largest military investment program in modern German history. The promise was to finally cast off the Bundeswehr's image of empty warehouses, outdated weapons, and painfully slow procurement. 3 years on, that dramatic shift is still a reference point, but converting it into tangible gains has been far from straightforward. The conversation is no longer about whether the intent was genuine. It's about how much of that ambition is now visible in real assets on the ground. The central pillar of this drive was the 100 billion Sondervermögen, a special fund created outside the regular budget to accelerate modernization. At its launch in 2022, the idea was to channel that money into closing the most urgent gaps: air defense, heavy armor, modern combat aircraft, secure communications. Over time, the shopping list has evolved. Early commitments centered on flagship platforms like the F-35 and upgraded Eurofighters, but by 2024, the scope had clearly widened. Secure digital networks, satellite reconnaissance, and ammunition stockpiles entered the priority list, reflecting both lessons from Ukraine's high-tempo fighting and NATO's urging that Germany strengthen less visible but essential capabilities. One clear example came with a multi-year Rheinmetall framework agreement worth roughly $5 billion for 155 shells, signaling a serious push to rebuild munitions reserves and production capacity alongside headline weapons buys. The fund's structure allowed procurement decisions to bypass the slower annual budget process, giving officials room to commit to major programs more quickly. On paper, the results look dramatic. By mid-2025, multi-billion euro contracts had been signed for new Leopard 2A8 main battle tanks, additional naval frigates, helicopter fleet replacements, integrated air defense upgrades, and unmanned systems. Yet the contrast between signed contracts and fielded equipment remains stark. Many projects are still in the earliest production phases, with factories retooling for new armor designs or avionics. Supply chain strains, especially in electronics, have also slowed progress. For now, the Bundeswehr can point to a substantial pipeline of assets ordered, but far fewer are yet operational. One major shift from the immediate post-invasion period is the scale of procurement. In 2022, some early purchases were limited in scope, small numbers of vehicles or quick replacements for aging kit that could be delivered fast. These served mainly as political and strategic signals. Today, orders are on an entirely different level, with contracts covering equipment for full brigades rather than piecemeal upgrades. That means hundreds of infantry fighting vehicles instead of a handful, alongside comprehensive packages for training, sustainment, and spare parts. The approach aims to rebuild coherent, fully equipped formations, not just swap out individual systems. Logistics and lifecycle planning have become more central to how contracts are structured. Previously, acquisition often prioritized the platform itself, leaving support systems underfunded. Recent deals routinely embed long-term service agreements, digital maintenance tracking, and joint NATO training components from the outset. Policymakers argue this is essential to ensure new kit can be deployed and maintained effectively, avoiding the readiness problems that have long plagued the Bundeswehr. Despite that momentum, there are clear obstacles. Some high-profile projects are bogged down in negotiations over detailed specifications. Upgrades to air defense, while urgent on paper, have faced cost increases and delays in integrating with NATO command systems. Naval programs are constrained by limited yard capacity and shortages of skilled shipbuilders after decades of contraction in the sector. Even with contracts secured, delivery timelines often stretch years ahead, creating inevitable lag between political commitment and military utility. Tracking actual deliveries alongside contracts gives a clearer picture. In lighter categories, small arms, light vehicles, certain drones, the interval between signature and handover can be measured in months. In heavier categories like tanks and transport aircraft, the first units are appearing in 2025, but in much smaller numbers than ultimately ordered. For example, some Leopard 2A8 tanks have been handed over for training and exercises, but the bulk of the order remains in production. New aircraft acquisitions are progressing through pilot training and infrastructure preparation, with in-country basing still years away. Within the armed forces, there is a strong awareness that political will and stable funding may not last indefinitely. This has created pressure to move as much of the Sondervermögen into firm contracts or advanced approval as possible. By mid-2025, ministry officials reported that most of the initial, urgent packages were either signed or in accelerated approval, representing many billions of euros in commitments, though scheduled deliveries often extend well into the late 2020s. While contracting heavily front-loads the process, it does not resolve the gap between commitments on paper and operational capability in the field. The progression from small, symbolic orders toward whole unit reconstruction reflects a deeper shift in strategic thinking. The initial steps in 2022 were reactive, meant to respond to immediate geopolitical shock and signal alignment with allies. The current planning is more tightly aligned to NATO's multi-year force readiness cycles, aiming to integrate incoming capabilities directly into joint formations and exercises rather than letting them sit idle. This means designing modernization trajectories that build not just for visible capacity, but for depth, redundancy, and resilience, qualities largely absent in the Bundeswehr's recent history. Still, the long-term sustainability of this procurement drive is far from guaranteed. Defense industry executives note that maintaining current production volumes will require predictable funding streams beyond the lifespan of the Sondervermögen. Firms are adding factory shifts and training new workers to match the surge in orders, but such expansions carry risk if demand falters later. For the government, contracting as much as possible now is a hedge, locking in production commitments while the political environment allows. As 2025 unfolds, the story is one of clear progress paired with persistent lag. Germany has moved from patching individual gaps to attempting comprehensive formation rebuilds, from prestige buys to heavy investment in supporting systems. The project lists and signed contracts convey ambition at a scale unseen since reunification. Yet on bases and in depots, much of that ambition is still embodied in future delivery schedules rather than deployable assets. What is in motion so far demonstrates that Berlin has activated its procurement machinery at an unprecedented pace. The question that follows is whether this accelerated contracting and expanded scope can be sustained within the constraints of its wider defense budget, and how those limits shape the next phase of rearmament. The budget, sir, and its real limits. Against that backdrop of procurement ambitions, Germany's 2025 defense budget sets a new post-Cold War record. Berlin's allocations reached the NATO benchmark, roughly in the mid-euros 80 billions and around 2.4% of GDP, representing a steep climb from the levels that defined policy before 2022. This allows Germany to claim, at least numerically, that it has met the spending goal NATO allies have been pressing since 2014. It is a notable milestone, but one that could be quickly eroded by shifts in economic output or rising costs, making it less a fixed achievement and more a point of temporary balance. Within that headline figure, the breakdown of spending reveals where Berlin's priorities have shifted. Personnel costs still dominate, reflecting both the scale of the all-volunteer Bundeswehr and the need to attract skilled recruits in a competitive labor market. Pay, pensions, and benefits take a substantial share, supported by upgrades to housing, base infrastructure, and other quality-of-life measures meant to retain experienced operators and technicians. Without those efforts, Germany risks fielding advanced equipment without the trained people to operate and maintain it effectively. Modernization funding has risen faster than at any time in decades. This covers new air, naval, and land systems, alongside upgrades to extend the service life of older platforms and integrate them into joint operations. Much of this category overlaps with the 100 billion Sondervermögen, the special fund created in 2022 to accelerate urgent purchases, capital that is expected to be mostly spent by 2027. Blending its resources with the regular budget allows multi-year programs to stay funded beyond the lifespan of the special fund, a deliberate move to avoid starting projects that would later stall for lack of money. Research and development, though still smaller in absolute terms, has expanded compared to past budgets. The aim is to build domestic capacity in emerging military technologies rather than rely entirely on imports from allies. Funding covers AI-enabled command networks, counter-drone systems, advanced sensors, high-energy laser weapons, and German participation in multinational projects like the Future Combat Air System. The sums here are more modest than those for procurement, but the allocation signals an intent to influence the development of next-generation capabilities. Operational spending has also increased, even if it forms a smaller slice of the overall budget. Conducting large-scale alliance exercises, moving heavy forces across Europe, and maintaining high readiness all require more spending on fuel, transport, training areas, and consumables. Rising energy costs add to this burden, and while efficiency measures are in place, realistic field training remains too vital to cut back. Experience during the pandemic and from the war in Ukraine reinforced how quickly readiness can degrade without constant, credible exercises. One of the most visible shifts in the 2025 plan is the elevation of newer domains to the same strategic level as traditional hardware. Funding for the Cyber and Information Space Command has grown substantially, financing recruitment of IT specialists, hardening of networks against intrusion, and development of complex simulation environments for cyber training. In parallel, space capabilities now have a distinct budget line, covering military satellite communications, space-based Earth observation, and participation in NATO space domain awareness programs. Though these amounts are small compared to land or air forces, the dedicated funding marks a step away from the past practice of folding space-related spending into civilian projects with only marginal military relevance. Unmanned systems, particularly drones, have also gained more attention. The budget supports medium-altitude, long-endurance surveillance platforms, portable tactical drones for smaller units, and trials of unmanned ground and maritime vehicles. Lessons from Ukraine about both the offensive potential and the vulnerabilities of such systems are shaping Germany's approach, with funds also going to counter-drone technology to protect its own forces. All of these allocations operate under the constraints of Germany's constitutional debt brake, which limits federal borrowing. The Sondervermögen was a one-off exemption, created as an extraordinary response to a security crisis. In recent years, the government has also adjusted fiscal rules to permit certain defense-related borrowing or exemptions, an important change that makes it easier to structure multi-year procurement contracts without breaching the cap. Even so, defense spending competes directly with priorities like healthcare, pensions, and climate initiatives, and relaxing the brake further would require political deals that are never guaranteed. These fiscal limits influence not only what programs are funded, but also the pace at which they progress. To stay within legal constraints, contracts are often designed with long payment schedules, spreading costs across several years. This reduces immediate budget spikes, but can slow the arrival of urgently needed systems. Available industrial capacity, already stretched by increased orders, further restricts how fast spending can translate into deliveries. The debt brake also shapes the rhythm of defense investment. Sustaining the 2.4% of GDP figure depends on both economic growth and political will. A slowdown could force cuts or difficult trade-offs, while rapid GDP growth might lower the ratio unless defense budgets rise in step. For planners, the current level is less a permanent baseline than a political commitment that must be renewed every budget cycle. Even within the expanded resources of 2025, the Bundeswehr has to make choices. Not every desired program can run at once, and prioritizing cyber, space, and unmanned systems has meant deferring upgrades to some traditional capabilities, like transport aircraft or large-scale munitions stockpiles. These trade-offs play out in parliamentary budget committees, where each service branch argues its case and negotiates against the fiscal ceiling. Meeting NATO's spending target carries diplomatic weight, especially after years of criticism, and the 2025 budget gives Berlin a tangible rebuttal to those doubts. But the figure sits close to the threshold, and sustaining it will require both continued political consensus and disciplined financial management. Much of the current increase has been made possible by one-time measures and special accounting treatments, tools that may not be available indefinitely. If the Sondervermögen winds down without replacement, Berlin will face the harder task of funding long-term commitments entirely from the regular budget. For now, reaching 2.4% of GDP provides clear political cover abroad and a stronger position in alliance planning. The larger question is whether this is the beginning of a stable new spending era or the peak of an exceptional cycle driven by immediate geopolitical pressures. However durable the headline figure proves, the structure of the budget reflects a deliberate attempt to align resources with the capabilities the Bundeswehr wants to field in the next decade. That alignment on paper does not guarantee timely results. Turning allocations into operational systems depends on how effectively the procurement system can move programs from approval to delivery, something that, in Germany's case, has long been one of the weakest links. Cutting through Berlin's procurement gridlock. For years, procurement in Germany was notorious within NATO for its protracted timelines and bureaucratic drag. Approval to buy a major system could be granted, budget secured, and yet years might pass before manufacturing even began. Multiple layers of legal review, sequential rather than parallel decision-making, and an appeals process that automatically froze work whenever a losing bidder challenged a contract kept projects moving at a glacial pace. Environmental assessments for even modest upgrades could stretch site preparation by many months. The cumulative effect was simple. Costs mounted, requirements shifted, and by the time deliveries arrived, the kit was often no longer cutting edge. The German government's 2024-2025 answer to this was to legislate a structural shake-up. The centerpiece is the Planning and Procurement Acceleration Act, the BWPBBG, which broadens and builds on emergency measures passed in 2022 to cover all Bundeswehr procurement. It was explicitly designed to chip away at entrenched bottlenecks. Among its concrete provisions, the suspensive effect of specific contract award appeals has been removed for defined defense programs, meaning work can begin while certain disputes are still being decided. New environmental exemptions apply to much of the defense infrastructure pipeline, and ministries can now make structured advance payments to contractors meeting early milestones, allowing production capacity expansion before final designs are locked. The Act also raises mandatory tender thresholds and suspends the practice of splitting orders into multiple lots for separate bidding until 2030, a step aimed at cutting duplication and shortening timelines. In practical terms, this aims to let German forces sign and fund projects faster, but industry still must deliver. The thinking in Berlin is that compressing the approval phase reduces dead time before factories can tool up, while giving industry early cash helps head off capacity shortfalls later. Where previously a new vehicle program might have faced sequential legal, fiscal, and environmental gates, the revised framework allows many of those to run in parallel, with lower risk decisions delegated to project teams rather than routed through multiple ministries. The late-stage legislative debate underscored that this isn't a full bypass of oversight. Provisions remain for independent audit of cost and performance, as well as legal recourse in cases of alleged irregularity. What the BWPBBG changes is the automatic freezing effect of those challenges. Instead of pausing an entire program for months while a court hears a procurement protest, production can progress under conditional safeguards. The government is betting that, under current threat conditions, the risk of modest procedural missteps is outweighed by the strategic cost of inaction. To illustrate the gap these reforms seek to close, consider the old baseline rather than specific contested examples. Heavy equipment acquisitions could take close to 3 years from initial requirement definition to contract signature, without counting the manufacturing phase. Smaller, commercial off-the-shelf buys, such as adapted civilian drones, might still spend upward of 12 months in evaluation and certification before units could train with them. These glacial timelines sat increasingly at odds with NATO readiness goals. Under the BWPBBG, processing times for clearly defined urgent requirements are now mandated to be significantly shorter, with pre-qualified suppliers eligible for direct award in certain categories. This applies not only to large prime contractors, but also to smaller firms and startups. One rationale for allowing advance payments early in the cycle is to encourage less established companies with promising technology, such as counter-drone systems or AI-driven surveillance platforms, to enter the defense market without absorbing prohibitive sunk costs before revenue starts. Streamlining also extends to the environmental clearance stage. Before the Act, a warehouse expansion for armored vehicle maintenance or an assembly hall retrofit for naval systems could require an exhaustive environmental impact assessment, pushing back the start of work well into the following budget year. Now, defined categories linked to Bundeswehr operational output can follow a simplified review, reducing pre-construction lag without removing environmental considerations entirely. For projects judged urgent to security, that difference can mean a workforce starting site work in months rather than after a year-long paper process. Critics point out that even the fastest contracting mechanism cannot conjure extra shipyard slots, skilled welders, or specialized machine tools overnight. Naval builds are still hemmed in by limited maritime infrastructure, and multinational programs, such as next-generation combat aircraft, move at the pace their slowest partner permits. The Act addresses the administrative piece of the puzzle, not the physical realities of industrial output or coordination with allies. Within the Bundeswehr's planning staff, however, the change is tangible. Officers handling requirements can now engage potential suppliers while still refining specifications, giving industry an early picture of likely contract terms and delivery expectations. That in turn allows firms to line up supply chains and workforce ahead of signature. While such lead time does not collapse the multi-year production phase, it can shorten gaps between commitment and first delivery, particularly for systems already in some form of production. Supporters in Parliament stress that prioritization is also evolving. With certain categories of projects now able to progress rapidly, services are resequencing their submissions so that quick-turn items climb the queue. These might be communications upgrades, modular shelters, or light armored vehicles, deliverables that can appear on the ground within the same parliamentary term, maintaining momentum for reform. Longer, more complex programs are still being initiated, but their political utility in proving the acceleration might be limited until after 2030. Legal analysts note that the suspension of mandatory lot splitting until that date could draw challenges from smaller firms that traditionally bid on subcontracts rather than entire platforms. The government's counter-argument is that consolidation in the tendering phase speeds negotiation and removes interfaces between multiple suppliers, each of which could otherwise become a bottleneck. Whether this drives efficiency without curbing competition is likely to be tested in court over the coming years. Defense Ministry officials caution that early signs of improvement should be read carefully. The first generation of projects under the BWPBBG is still unfolding, and the actual production bottlenecks will be most visible once these accelerated contracts transition to the manufacturing floor. The appetite for rapid awards has to be matched by the ability of industry to scale, a point repeatedly raised in technical briefings to committees approving multi-year funds. In the meantime, NATO partners are watching. German delays have long been factored into alliance planning and multinational readiness exercises. Trimming those timelines even modestly could alter force generation models and the credibility of pledged capabilities in contingency scenarios. If Berlin demonstrates it can sustain such changes over successive budget cycles, it would mark a break from patterns entrenched for decades. Whether acceleration translates into real operational gains will come down not to parliamentary votes or legal clauses, but to the pace at which ordered hardware emerges from assembly lines, passes trials, and reaches deployed units.